Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest of Sheffield Haworth's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion webinars, and our first discussion specific to the APAC region. For those in our audience who are less familiar with Sheffield Haworth, we're a talent and executive search consultancy, and our aim is to help people and organisations realise their potential. And a diverse and inclusive workforce is absolutely central to this aim. And as we all know, every organisation and region has its own challenges in diversity and equity and inclusion. And whilst there aren't any one-size-fits-all answers, we hope that today's panel discussion will provide some insights, some ideas, and certainly some encouragement. So I won't delay any longer. I'd love to welcome our highly accomplished and diverse panel, and thank you all for being with us today. Abigail Brown, let me come to you first. Abby, you lead the Executive Talent Acquisition for Standard Chartered Bank in APAC. Please tell us a little about yourself.
Thank you, Helen. My name's Abigail Brown and I work at Standard Chartered and actually sit in our executive hiring team, so covering managing director and executive hiring here in Asia. I'm from the UK originally, had a stint over in Australia as well, so I was there for 10 years and I've been in Singapore for the last 4 years. And in addition to hiring, look, really passionate about the D&I challenges, questions and conversations that are happening certainly across the world and in the region at the moment.
Thank you very much, Abby. And Colin, let me come to you next. Colin Teo is a principal in BCG's Singapore office and is one of the authors of the Diversity Dividend in Southeast Asia. Colin, please tell us about yourself.
Sure. Very happy to be here today.
Thank you.
Everybody, just a short introduction. I'm a principal, as Helen mentioned, in the Boston Consulting Group Singapore office. In my day job, I'm a core member of the public sector and telco, media and tech practice areas with deep experience in digital topics in that area. Actually, in my additional hat that I wear in BCG, I lead up the BCG diversity and inclusion topic in Southeast Asia. And I'm deeply passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Recently, I led a landmark study and wrote a report that's public on D&I in Southeast Asia across multiple dimensions of gender, ethnicity, age, LGBTQ status, immigrant status, disability. And I'm very happy to share more later today.
Thank you so much. And Julia, let me come to you next. Julia Van Grass is founder of Speak, which is a culture change and leadership consultancy, and I think probably a lot more than that as well. Julia, please tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Helen. Co-founder of Speak, otherwise my co-founders might get a bit upset. I've had a 20-year career in professional services. So most recently, before Speak, was a partner at EY in Australia, have also worked over in the UK, Europe and the Middle East with Alex Partners. I've had a long interest in diversity and inclusion, so have been on many panels and have taken a personal interest in it. But really my work over the last couple of years supporting leadership teams in courageous leadership, helping them reach their organisational potential through courageous leadership has sort of led me into more strategic issues around human potential and D&I topics, so particularly around anti-racism and D&I topics as well.
Thanks, Julia. And to Susan Entwistle, a partner in EY Australia, specialising in financial services and digital technology. Susan, please tell us a little about your background.
Thanks, Helen. I've been in professional services for over 20 years. I started out as a software engineer, very passionate about technology, did a PhD, worked for Hewlett & Packard Enterprise Services, CEO advisory work, industry thought leadership, joined Cognizant, headed up One Digital Engineering, and more recently have joined EY. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia.
Thank you, Susan. So we'll move on to our first topic. We might have set a rather ambitious agenda today. We've got 3 topics that we'd like to cover. The first is how are global organisations achieving greater gender equality in the APAC region. And first of all, Susan, I'll come back to you and ask you specifically, with your experience of the technology sector, what do you think has worked well, and what aren't we doing?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I've been in this industry for 20 years, and in that period, I've often been the only female in the room. And in this time, we've all watched digital and technology become pervasive across our lives. When I look globally, I believe Australia's lagged in the adoption of diversity and inclusion compared to our global efforts. We're looking at the statistics, women still remain underrepresented, along with other minority groups, whether that's ethnicity or LGBTIQ+. And today, 28% of the Australian workforce in IT is female, and 1 in 4 IT grads are female, and there's a persistent pay gap of around 19%. And that is similar trends for other minority groups. And when we consider that we're designing for a future where digital will become more pervasive and at the core, we need that different perspective and experience in the room in order to create products and services that are relevant and safe. So a great example of that is crash test dummies were designed for the average male body in the past, and it put women at risk. I do believe we're at the point where there's the awareness and the leadership commitment around the importance of inclusion. And, you know, leadership are committing, and strategies are being put in place and actions taken with measurable outcomes. You know, at EY, we've got a Women in Technology program that's focused on education, diversity, inclusion, the incubation of female talent, and promoting female talent. When I look within our industry, I think what's worked really well is awareness and education. There's a wide range of events. There's conversations occurring. There's training to inspire and engage to create a more level playing field. I do think when we look at things like unconscious bias training, we need to rename that and drop unconscious. It ultimately is a bias that is holding people back and discriminatory. I think that what's worked well is hiring and promotion, balanced interview slates across the diversity ranges, spanning from graduates to leadership, that are being tracked and measured. I've led a diverse and inclusive team where I had balance, and I know within the EY consulting team in the global leadership, it's 41% women. That takes effort to achieve, given the talent in the market. I think that it's important around mentoring to help grow and engage talent. In terms of areas where I think we're underinvested or there's more opportunity, sponsorship, I think that we need to open up opportunities for minority groups that have the capability. It's not that they're lacking and need to lean in, they just need to be given or provided with that opportunity to thrive. Workforce flexibility, we're tending to lose talent at the mid-level careers. And I think that's the result of both cultural norms and policies and new ways of work. And hopefully through this experience of COVID, we can break some of those down. I don't think that we celebrate and promote the amazing female talent and other groups enough to inspire and engage.
Thanks, Susan. That's really helpful. And I suppose it's the pace of change as well. Do you have any thoughts on, is this taking too long?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
When you look at the LGBTI community, I think that they made significant progress in acceptance at a fast pace. And I see no reason we cannot do that with focused effort in other underrepresented groups. And I believe it's really our moral responsibility.
Yeah.
And we know it's good for business performance and innovation. And
yeah, thank you. Yeah, Abby, let me come to you next, because as a talent acquisition specialist, do you see particular interventions working well to increase the diversity? tell us a little about your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. When we were talking before, actually, I said I started off my career in the UK, moved via Australia and to Singapore, and it's almost like some of the D&I conversations have been following me around the world. I feel almost. I think I left the UK in 2007 and landed in Australia, and some of these conversations were just starting to evolve then. You know, and it was quite a change for me going from a UK that had been having these conversations for a while to Australia that was emerging in having the conversations. But you know, in the 10 years I was there, the change was definitely there, even from things like, you know, maternity pay and people having time off, you know, the conversations, the cultural and inclusional changes that I saw. And there's still you know, a very, very long way to go. And then coming to Singapore, which is then covered in a really different way because we have the Asia region, which isn't just a country and one culture. It's a you know, huge variety of different cultures that then become important in how you're sensitive to that, because it isn't then just about gender. It's how does that you know, incorporate into some very strong culture beliefs and people's lives here as well. So I think you know, there's a real complexity to some of the conversations, and as you said before, look, there is no right or wrong, and there isn't a one size fits all. We're all learning and developing, and hopefully this sharing of ideas really helps. When I look at talent acquisition, I think you know, there were definitely some really powerful statements happening in Australia when I was there. Typically the larger corporations, quite often the banks, that were being very forthright, and at the time I was in recruitment agencies, so we were supplying to them, that if your shortlist was not diverse and was not 50-50, then you weren't able to submit, basically. You know, it was very black and white. And that really pushed people. And at the start, it was very uncomfortable. And it was really challenging because you had to say, well, am I just filling people into this just to create the numbers so I can get the people through I want to? And that wasn't the purpose of it. So I think it's really important to make sure that you put policies, procedures, practices, whatever they are, in place that are thoughtful, realistic, and also that then are adding value in the right way, but making sure that the people that are involved in that are doing the right thing. So yes, you have to work harder to sometimes uncover this, you know, really unique talent, but you know, it's really important to do that. So, I mean, certainly that they're the kind of things that change a dial from a TA perspective. Is how can you make sure you've got, you know, how are you pushing your shortlist to be diverse? And that's definitely one thing we look at. And look, this is quite focusing on gender. We do have focus on nationalities as well at Standard Chartered as well. But I think here the topic from a gender perspective is get your shortlist balanced. And there's, you know, many studies out there that show if you can, even if you had, it's not having at least one female in there, but even if you had, say, 2 or 3, you're then comparing females with other females, not females with males, which typically ends up happening with 1 female. Whereas if you can at least have 2 females minimum, then you start to compare with each other. The success rate of hiring females increases dramatically. Also having diverse interview panels, so the people interviewing, and again, the conversations are, this isn't a tick box, I've had a female on the panel, great. This is, they need to have a voice at the table in these decision-making capabilities, so that you know, we really can start to change the dial. So I think there's some very, you know, there's some fairly black and white things that that can go into place. But I at the moment, you know, there is a real, we're in COVID and we're in a economic climate which is you know, is incredibly sensitive and very challenging. So there is a, you know, another conversation point at the moment which, you know, I think we were making some really big steps, you know, as an industry and also, you know, across regions, of pushing this gender dial without a doubt. Now the challenging conversation that we're having to have is internal first versus creating diversity. And therefore, you know, if we are, and there are companies restructuring, there's redundancies happening, there's furlongs happening, etc. So when you're then in a position where you have redundancies and people at risk, and at the same time you're trying to change the dial on this gender equality, it can be incredibly confronting to hiring managers, to organisations, to say, do you take your internal talent? But what if that isn't actually gender diverse at all? What do you do then? And there isn't a right or wrong to that. I think, you know, we're in a year of, you know, a year that we've not seen before, and therefore it is, you know, it's really hard. But I think, you know, the right thing to do is to make sure we're having the conversation, to make sure we're pushing things in the right way that we can.
Thanks. And so going into next year, that's going to come more and more into focus, I would imagine, trying to get that balance right.
Yeah, and look, at the moment, people are having to make some calls and decisions based on where we're at, and you have a natural nurturing impact if you've got good performing people in your organization in this kind of climate and challenging times. You do want to make sure you do the right thing by them, that you are retaining great talent. But the challenge comes when you can't then retain, if you have no diversity in those talent pools, you can't change that. So I think I can see potentially that we're going to go back before we can go forward, potentially just by default. But I think it's just being mindful, having the conversations, and as I say, with all of this, there is no right or wrong, but it's just trying to do what we can to make impact where we can.
Yeah, thank you. And Colin, let me come to you next. I'm interested to know, in the diversity dividend study that you did, what were the particular findings around gender diversity?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I must say is that one obvious thing is I'm not a woman in this conversation, so I an external point of view, but a very passionate person on D&I. I do want to actually echo Abby's point, because it really resonated with me. That actually one of the things we did not write in the report is actually companies that, if we look at the 2008 financial crisis versus the current crisis, and we look at what companies did during trying times, companies that actually continue to maintain the scoring, we had a methodology on high D&I efforts, actually ended up better actually on their annualized return, in fact 4x better annualized return. So I think that Abby's absolutely right that companies have very difficult choices to make today, right? Where you might have to furlough employees, you might have to downsize, rationalize. But I think in the longer term, it's not only the right moral thing to do, in all cases, to look at diversity holistically, but the 2008 experience actually told us that they actually paid longer term dividends, even though it might be short term painful to maintain a diverse slate and staff that you have. So I think that's one point that you mentioned that I felt like I had something to add. I also wanted to then share a bit more about what we found, as looking in the area of gender diversity. The report actually looked at the Southeast Asian nations of Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, 6 countries that don't really have much studies and publications done. And if you just ask yourself the questions of incidence, we surveyed 6,000 people. How many of your companies actually had policies or programs that support gender diversity and inclusion? The number for Southeast Asia averaged about 68%. That sounds great, but it's not good enough. I mean, if you look at our similar survey in the Western world, that number was about above 90%, right? So we were still lagging in this area by about 20 percentage points or so. Then we also asked the question of, if your company had any sort of gender and gender programs, diversity and inclusion policies that were explicit, how effective did you think it was? The number of people, the 68% of the people who had programs said it was effective. So that's really interesting, because when we look around the world, in the Western world, the incidence of programs are higher, but the perceived effectiveness is actually lower. So at least what the data is telling us is that where they exist, people value them a lot. And we're talking about women here in this cut of the sample data specifically. And so it really speaks to this question that a lot of corporate leaders ask me, which is it worth doing? Do we just copy and paste the Western template here or not? And the answer is we're nowhere near close enough, and people value it highly. And I think the third thing I wanted to share is we also then went to dig into all the individual kind of interventions, right? So I really, what Susan mentioned and what Abby mentioned also echoed a lot with me, right? So, diverse slate of interviews, a clear anti-discrimination policy, bias-free evaluation, but we wanted to disaggregate that a little bit. So we asked all respondents which they thought were the most effective. And then we compared as a whole where everyone agreed, and then women versus men, LGBTQ versus heterosexual, racial minority versus not. And if we look at let me talk about where everyone agreed, right? So there are no regret moves. Specifically, what was top of everyone's list was just have a very simple, clear anti-discrimination policy. But as we all know, that having a policy doesn't result in implementation, but that's a first step if your company doesn't have one. Second, you need to have a state of play. You need to know where your company is. And everyone always poo-poos surveys, but in a lot of companies, they don't even measure what's not working, right? Asking your employees on confidential surveys. 3, bias-free evaluations and promotions. That's a big thing that everyone, whether you're a man or woman, everyone agrees is really important. And lastly, there's this term, what we call, it's a bit of a jargon, but we call moment of truth interventions, right? So where you cannot formalize things with policies, what does your manager do at that point when you're in need and when you have something important? If you're a working mom, you need to go home and take care of your kid. Regardless of what the policy says, what does your manager do? Or if you're a woman and a guy says something quite misogynistic in a room, what does your manager do? It's regardless of policy. And so that came out as the 5th most important thing. Everyone agrees it's important. But the 2 things I wanted to call out where women put it really highly versus men, which I found interesting, and happy to hear everyone's thoughts on it, were structural workplace interventions. The examples we gave were more around mothers, so things like nursing rooms. I think it might reflect the fact that men just don't think about such things. And secondly, more flexible and accommodative leave policies, not just for themselves as women, but also paternal leave. And we also got a lot of comments around even for adoption, that leaves, the way leave is used today is a little bit too constrained, and how it supports women in the workforce. So those were the 2 areas that was a big disjunct between what women said in our survey and what men said, basically. So just that was what we found.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, and I'm sure we'll all be reading the report as to refresh on some of those areas. And Julia, in your role as a leadership coach, what are the actions you're seeing companies take, or that you're helping advise leaders to take?
Yeah, look, I think all of the things that have been talked about here today are the sorts of things that organisations are going through. I think the conversations that I've been having are probably more about what's getting in the way, because everyone knows what to do. So we've got the reports, they've got the data, people know what to do. For me, the question that I've been having with leaders is, what to do. So what is it that's getting in the way in your organisation? And for me, it's about, you've got to be able to name it first. So it's almost to Colin's point, like what's the moment of truth, or what are the moments of truth in your organisation, and really embracing that truth in your organisation of what is getting in the way. Because if the leadership team can't name the truth in the organisation, then it doesn't matter what policy is in place, what framework, what the D&I Council is doing, how good the chair is, whatever is, how many women are involved, how many men are on board, nothing is going to change. And so for me, that's been the most sort of important conversation, and really where I've seen change happen or fail in organisations has been where there's been that embracing of truth. So what does that involve? Tough conversations, challenging the status quo. It's really involved a culture of, like, a courageous culture. What's that meant in terms of it's been actually attaching KPIs, like generally financial KPIs, to change. So having a passionate sort of plea of, we want to do this and we're all going to get on board and we'll make it happen over a period of time. I've generally not seen that work as much as people, hearts and minds are willing. That's generally not seen step change results in my experience. It's seen small shifts, and I've seen pockets of change happen where there's been hearts and minds willing, but I've not seen sort of that real step change across organisations where there's not been KPIs attached to it that actually drive that sort of outcome. So I think they're the sorts of conversations I've been having. People have got to be able to name it. They've got to be able to explain what gets in the way. They've got to be able to explain, to Susan's point earlier around, it's not unconscious bias. In a lot of organisations, there is systemic bias and privilege that gets in the way. So we're asking people to give up, their seat at the table, to give it to someone else, or to bring in an extra chair. And that's very, very uncomfortable for people that have, had a seat at the table for a very long period of time. To Abby's point before, I've been in a recruitment process where they've told me about their great D&I policy, and I've not met any women in the recruitment process. And I've said to them, well, you've demonstrated to me that you're not serious about D&I, because I've not met any females in the decision-making process. So it doesn't stack up. So I think these are the sorts of, it's the unspoken things as much as the spoken things. And these are the moments of truth, I think, for leaders in organisations. Because that's what people see in the that's what the rest of the organisation is seeing, not the policy document.
And that point about financial KPIs, are you seeing that begin to get adopted, and how harsh can they be?
I am seeing it. I've not. I'd love to know what Colin's seen, whether that came through in the research that he's done. But I have been seeing KPIs coming through.
Yeah, it's becoming more common. It wasn't common at all in Southeast Asia. I think what we're seeing, as Julia, I fully agree with you, is that it's becoming common for gender diversity, but for other aspects, it's not yet there in terms of financial KPIs.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll move on to the second topic now, but I think there'll be themes that are running throughout all of this. And the next one we wanted to focus on was more around how some of these interventions are extending to include ethnic diversity, and how organisations enable diverse teams across spread geographic areas to work together inclusively. And Colin, let me come to you first on that. Can you talk a bit about what the unique challenges are specifically to the Southeast Asia region around ethnic diversity?
Yeah, I think I thought a lot about that question, and I think there are three key challenges that I think are quite unique to the Southeast Asian region. Not too familiar with the Australian market specifically, but I think the first is that outsiders rarely understand or appreciate, maybe they know it, but how actually diverse Southeast Asia is. Just some facts here, right? It has more than 100 ethnic groups, depending on how you define it. Just to stop and think about that versus the kind of D&I conversations that we've been having in America, where it's a lot about institutional racism. In some ways, minorities are classified into 5-6 groups. We have 655 million people here too in Southeast Asia, and depending on how you count languages and dialects, 1,000 of them, about 1,000 languages and dialects. So you're operating in a market that's twice the size of America, with maybe 100 or so ethnic groups, 1,000 languages, 655 million people, cross-boundary. The complexity is far higher in Southeast Asia, and I think underappreciated. The other thing about that complexity, and just a really concrete example, is what is a minority racial group in one country can be a majority racial group in another country. I mean, let's be concrete here, right? I mean, if you look at Malaysia, I would be in a minority racial group, but then it also intersects with socioeconomic class, right? And yeah, these historical conversations on Chinese minority in Malaysia, Indonesia, whereas in Singapore, the Chinese ethnicity is in the majority. The other thing that we found extremely difficult to get a good handle on data is if you look at Philippines. If you actually look at Indonesia, Philippines, on each of the different islands where they're from, from outsiders, like it's all Filipinos, but it's not true actually. People do see themselves with different dialect groups. So I think that's challenge number one: extremely rich diversity, underappreciated. I think challenge number two is that race and ethnicity can be unusually sensitive in different Southeast Asian countries for different reasons. So while we don't have the historical, I would say, baggage of slavery, which some countries have, we do. Race is in quite a few countries is mixed in with religion, and there's been histories of race riots in not more than 60 years ago, right? And so the conversation of race in a lot of countries is, I would say, in some cases, in a very nascent stage and in infancy. And there are some topics that are seen as live wires that are not really discussed fully in the open. For example, even in Singapore, there are laws, against incitement of, I would say, animosity against someone's race or religion. So it creates a bit of a difficult room to navigate, to have those conversations in some of these countries, right? So I think that's the other complexity that I think companies, in this area have to navigate with. I think the last thing I'll mention that's quite challenging for ethnicity and race in this region is that a lot of the interventions that we surveyed and found would help are quite hard to implement. They require a certain critical mass, which creates a chicken or egg problem. I think this was reflected in our prior conversation where we're talking about balanced interview slates specifically, and also employee affiliation, support groups, mentorship networks specifically. Those were the three things that when we asked people of minority races across the 6 countries, they put super high versus the majority race. Everyone agreed on those standard stuff we talked about, the anti-discrimination policy and everything. But if you take a step back and think about what you need to do in order to have a balanced interview slate, like it's sometimes a chicken and egg problem. How do you even get there in order for that to be effective? How do you create an employee support group if there are already so few of certain kinds of minorities in companies? And how do you bootstrap that? I think that's a real challenge in this region too. So those are the 3 views I have on this.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. And Abby, I was going to ask you next, because you're clearly actively involved in this market. For you, what do you see as the importance of nationality diversity in that workplace?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think when we talk D&I, the default almost becomes gender, but luckily the conversations are moving on to say it's not just about gender, it's about the whole breadth of what does diversity mean, and that's all encompassing, and it's a huge topic when you get started. So gender becomes a natural default, but then I think the next sort of next default is nationality. And it's absolutely critical and important. I mean, any of the studies that you go to would talk about this, that diversity, about companies being, certainly more productive, revenues, etc., with a diverse pool of talent. And I think that's the aim of where all of these conversations are really driving. So it's absolutely critical. It's essential. I think then it's how do you get there? So look, we are very lucky in Singapore because it is an incredibly diverse place. Having recruited across the region, I think there's some really interesting conversations that happen in Asia, and I think there's a couple of I'll come on to inclusion in a second, but I think from a country specific, sometimes there are conversations that we're having with some of our countries where actually they want to create diversity in their nationalities because their entire management team are from the country. And actually they see that now as being probably a hindrance rather than a benefit. So they really are, and how do we help to change that dial? Certainly for, we're a large global bank, so it's a little bit easier for us to be able to shift and move talent around. And therefore I think it's really important for us to use that internal mobility to move people to different countries. And that's, one of the benefits of working in a large corporate, and certainly the positive way that you can impact workforce. So I think that becomes really really helpful, and I think more and more leaders are starting to see that they need that diversity. We have it in, obviously, if I come to Singapore, we're diverse. If I was thinking back in Australia, look, there's certainly more nationality diversity happening there, and the UK incredibly diverse on nationalities. But there's definitely pockets, I think, once we get to Asia, certainly some of the emerging markets where there's definitely an opportunity to bring different talent in. But what I have seen in my time here, not just within the bank, but in my previous role recruiting into the region, I think more and more companies were becoming very interested in not just bringing their workforce in to the country or region that they're trying to expand, but actually bringing that workforce in, upskilling the individuals that are actually in the office or in the environment to be able to then almost leave, but leave with that legacy. Because what doesn't necessarily work is you open an office in a new country and basically bring in an expat workforce and think that that's the solution, because it's not. And because of the cultural challenges and conversations and sensitivities that go on, that doesn't always get the best out of people. And I've watched people move into Asia thinking that they'll be absolutely fine, they'll take off on day one, and what's the problem? And then a few months later, we've talked to them about maybe some cultural leadership training. And the outcome of that has been, there were things I hadn't thought about before I came here. I thought I was great with people, and I am great with people. But what I didn't realize was, in some cultures, if you said to people, are you okay? By default, they'll say yes, even if they're not. Or if you're in a group call, for example, and you pause to say, does anyone have any questions? One culture may take 1 or 2 seconds to respond. Another may take a good 10 to 15 seconds. But for some cultures, to pause for 15 seconds is incredibly uncomfortable. So when you start to then look at that, and especially, if you are in a regional Asia role, you could easily have 10, 15 different countries or nationalities on a call at any one time. So how do you navigate that? So it's incredibly complex. So just, I think that second point of the experience of working in different countries therefore becomes really, really important. And it becomes important for productivity, it becomes important for retaining workforce, attracting workforce, etc. And then I think also when you start to hone in on looking at your business externally, it becomes incredibly important around your customers and the markets you're operating in. So certainly for Standard Chartered, we operate in Africa and China are two very key markets for us, as well as a huge operation around emerging markets. So for us, it's really important to say, how can we mobilize and how can we be utilizing our African talent and our Chinese talent, because they've got a huge impact value for us globally and outside of their respective countries. So I think when I pull back, is it important for us to have diverse nationalities? Absolutely. Is it complex? Absolutely. And therefore, do we encourage people to get exposure in different countries, and will that help their career and help the organisation? Definitely. And I think Singapore's been really interesting to work in as well. If I think of, certainly the Singapore government's remit on making sure there's a certain population or percentage of locals versus expats, for example, and that's been very stringently looked at, and I think is absolutely the right way to go. What they're also really interested in is making sure that Singaporeans, for example, are given opportunities overseas, so that they can go overseas to get great experience and get that kind of global mindset to be able to come back to Singapore and be able to upskill themselves and the country as well. So I think there's some different ways of tackling it. Is it important? Absolutely. But then the next conversation that goes with that is, it's great that we want to move nationalities around. The most important piece of that is, how do you create an inclusive culture that allows those people to have a voice at the table? Because there's no point in doing any of this, whether it's gender or nationality, if those people then aren't their absolutely full selves at work, aren't able to contribute fully, and aren't able to be listened to. So I think that's the other key is, when you do have different nationalities, in environments, to make sure that you are very sensitive to, different people's cultures, views, and having a voice as well.
Thanks. And one of the questions we've had from the audience has been quite specifically around the cultural leadership training. Abby, have you tried and tested different ways of approaching that?
Yeah, look, I think back and I looked into this a bit. Back originally, it was a training when you did, if you did a relocation, part of the relocation company package was cultural training. And I remember my naivety. I'd moved from the UK to Australia, and I was 30 at the time, thought I knew it all, and clearly didn't. And then I came from Australia and thought, I've moved before. Singapore, is a fairly easy country to move to, from what I've heard. I was working recruitment, I'm sure it can't be that difficult, and landed, and wow, blew my mind, because suddenly then you're starting to understand, and there's cultural training, and just practically you're recruiting in different countries with completely different packages as to what's on offer to people, and really huge complexity. So if you come out of, like I say, the UK or Australia, massive markets, but you're typically in a very, very similar package environment with what's offered to employees, you come into Asia and it's completely different, to the point that I remember somebody once saying to me, dependents, I presumed they had children, as I would assume, your dependents are covered. And then later on I asked them about your children. They said, I don't have kids. I was really perplexed. I was like, but you said you had dependents. And in certain countries, dependents also in your medical insurance cover your elderly parents, not your children. So just really small things like this, that you come into a region that becomes incredibly complex. So I think there's an element to that. I think the relocation sort of cultural training that happens is probably fairly much more about you assimilating yourself into a culture. But I was lucky enough to go on to training with somebody in the region, and happy to share details after the event, which was specifically around how do you lead and how do you work from a business perspective in Asia from a cultural perspective. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And I did that probably 2 years in, and wish I had done it when I first landed. It was incredibly eye-opening and made me look back and say, wow, there's things I've definitely learned. And there's things that I really, need to be a lot more mindful of that I haven't.
Thanks, and do please share those details afterwards.
Yeah, more than
pass
happy
them
to.
on to others. Julia, let me bring it to you and the conversation in Australia more specifically, particularly around inclusion of ethnic diversity and First Nations and Indigenous people. What are you seeing?
So I think Australia would consider itself quite a multicultural country, and I think if you ask the average person in the street, is Australia very tolerant and anti-racist, I think we would consider we are. But what I've seen in organisations and particularly over the course of the last couple of years, I guess politically and in society, is that we're probably not as tolerant and as anti-racist as we would like to think that we are. And so for me, there's a lot of work that the Diversity Council of Australia have been doing. There are a lot of particularly Chinese-born Australians who have come out and started talking about the bamboo ceiling in Australia, in addition to the glass ceiling that women have been experiencing. So I think cultural diversity has started to be on the agenda for a number of companies. I think those that are already operating globally have, it's been on the agenda because they've operated in the region. For other corporates that haven't had to, I don't think it's been an issue. They've just, we take talent from the area, and if we happen to pick up multicultural Australians, that's great. So it's not really been an issue for a lot of Australians. I think from an Indigenous and First Nations perspective, what I'd say is there are huge systemic issues in Australia from really a First Nations perspective, from a government perspective. So if we look at the Closing the Gap report that's come out, there are a lot of issues that need to be fixed. So if I look at just the employment gap between Indigenous Australia, I think only about 50% of Indigenous Australians are actually in employment opportunities, compared to 75% of non-Indigenous Australians. And that's sort of the best statistic in terms of the smallest gap. If you look then down at those that are achieving sort of Year 12 highest education levels, then at the incarceration rates for children. So there's huge gaps. Life expectancy gap is also very huge. So there are huge systemic issues that need to be fixed. What does that mean from an employment perspective and for employers? It means that there are systemic issues that need to be fixed, but employers can't sit around and wait for the government to fix those issues. So my sort of call to action to employers would be, what role are you going to play in creating change here? So we can't all sit around and wait for the government to fix things and to close the gap and to create change. There's been a huge influx of activity, sort of some grassroots and some sort of performative activism off the back of Black Lives Matter in the US, which I think is a good place for us to start in Australia. It is very sort of US driven, and there are a number of people in Australia, particularly there are a lot of Indigenous issues that need to be resolved. There are organisations who are now saying, hey, we do want to be part of the solution in Australia, to actually working with our Indigenous and First and Torres Strait Islander people to help solve the problem and to start listening and being a part of fixing things. And I think organisations have a role to play here. So for me, there's a moral obligation here for employers to play. I think it's part of their civic duty. I think of being a good corporate citizen. So, being an employer and of choice, and saying, things like employers coming out when the plebiscite happened and saying, we stand for equal rights, and so we support the plebiscite and we support being an inclusive workplace, LGBTIQ, and saying this is what we stand for. I think it's the same around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and saying we're going to stand for being an inclusive workplace and making equal opportunities. So I think it's an opportunity for employers to actually stand up and be counted and say this is what they stand for.
Okay, Julia, thank you. And Susan, I was interested in your particular experience, because you've managed remote teams, and that will have had all sorts of regional and ethnic diversity within. What have you found has been your experience in that?
Yeah, so I've been working with remote teams for really my entire career. And to Abigail's point, I really think that experience of interacting and travelling and building up an awareness through that is critical. If I step back, I think that the fundamental approach of inclusion across minority groups is common, and inclusion really needs to be a core value of the organisation and its people, and that's where it needs to start. And it needs to be a leadership value that requires commitment and action, and then is supplemented with things like cultural awareness and other initiatives. But fundamentally, you want to build a group, a team of people who are open and able to listen and humble, that want to connect on our commonality and respect people's differences, and that really creates a space, a safe space for people to be themselves, where they'll be respected for the contribution that they bring, so that they can feel that they belong and that they do belong. And I believe it requires courage and conviction as well, that if you see behaviour that is discriminatory, it's not tolerated, because it's that behaviour that we walk past is what we accept, and it's what we get. And in turn, we also need to make sure that we address the systemic problems, so that we enact at pace various initiatives, policies and programs that are measurable and accountable, so that we can drive that change and continue to drive it. But I think fundamentally, as to Julia's point, it's really bringing together both the hearts and minds, and it needs to start with the heart and be supported with the mind, the programs that have teeth.
And I think that brings us neatly actually towards our final topic, and we have 10 minutes left, so we may have to give this slightly less attention, but I think we started on this already, really, which is, in the time that we're in at the moment, whilst we're still going through COVID, how do companies ensure inclusion of staff whilst there's still this sustained period of remote working? How do we look after people that still need to shield whilst others might be returning, and so on? And Julia, I was going to ask you first, how do you advise leaders to be inclusive at this time?
Yeah, I actually think this is one of the silver linings to come out of COVID, is that there is more care and connection. And so conversations about mental health, conversations about how people feel, conversations about, is it okay to feel not okay at work? conversations about family, having, you know, daughters photobombing your your webcams and things like that. So we're actually seeing people in their environments at home, and seeing a part of people that we wouldn't necessarily see at work. That said, it's got to be a safe space for people to be able to have those conversations. So one of the things that I've been talking to teams about is, you know, if you're not able to have that conversation with your team about, you know, how do you feel? Is it okay? Like, how are you feeling? You know, checking in on, you know, how do you feel out of 10 today? Like, that's a simple question that you can ask, you know, how's everyone feeling? If you don't feel, you know, just as a simple check-in at the start of a meeting, if someone doesn't feel that great, you can at least have a conversation offline to check in and see how someone's feeling. But it requires a level of vulnerability in the team, and that, you know, embracing vulnerability. If you don't have that vulnerability in the team to be able to have those conversations, well, there's a, you know, a deeper issue that you need to be able to work on there in the team.
Yeah.
That, for me, that's the sort of starting point in terms of building trust and inclusive environments and that sort of psychological safety.
Yeah, the psychological safety. Colin, let me come to you next, because I was interested in your view on how different groups are affected by remote working.
Yeah, I think that's one of those questions that we're getting a lot right now. I can give you a few illustrative examples, right? I think the one most obvious thing is Zoom, WebEx platforms such as these, right? And what we're seeing a lot in the working from home environment is that, I think Julia mentioned this, people inadvertently have to show their home environment. And one of the tips that we're using now, and we're giving a lot of that advice actually, is, you know, actually having an explicit discussion on whether it's okay to have people not turn on their webcams, specifically for LGBTQ plus employees, you know, with different living arrangements, they might not be comfortable being out. You know, if their partner walks by at the back, you know, giving people the permission or having that frank conversation about not having to turn on a webcam is actually sometimes important for people, right? And it's also for people from, you know, socioeconomic backgrounds which they do not feel so comfortable with. Not everyone has a room where they can, you know, have a quiet video conference in the middle of a living room with kids running around, you know. So that I think is a big thing about creating that new conversation. Second thing, I think we're seeing a lot of issues around being harder to raise, you know, if there are difficulties, problems in any particular way. On this, I'm 100% with Julia on this. Managers actually have to be even more proactive during work from home, when your teams are separate, to actually proactively check in. There's so much context that we lose as managers by not having, you know, that face-to-face connection. And so asking 1 to 10, having regular check-ins, being deliberate about that, I think that's really important. For caregivers specifically, we also see that it's, you know, much harder, especially when lockdowns include children not going to school. So being able to be flexible as managers around when your team has to deliver things, whether you need everyone to actually be working on the same cadence, starting at the same time and ending at the same time, but actually maybe giving the middle of the day back to parents or caregivers, is a flexibility that I think a lot of people value. Mm-hmm. And I think the last thing is, you know, on community. Building community is so much harder, and one difficulty we find that's the hardest is for new joinees. The fresh graduates who've just joined the workforce now are joining a company who they've never met a single person, and they just see a screen all day, right? So again, being deliberate about, I think, finding creative ways to build team culture and activities. I mean, it sounds as simple as, you know, do you want to organize trivia Thursdays? Can you do something together as a team? And that's not in the usual managerial, you know, vocabulary or muscle. And I think that's things that we have to try in this time.
Yeah, thank you. And conscious that we've just got sort of 4 minutes left. And Susan, how have you found it in this time building inclusive teams? Has it been different to your normal experience, or have there been extra layers of challenge?
Yeah, it's been different, and people have responded to it differently. You know, some have really enjoyed being at home and that flexibility, as Colin said, and others have really struggled and missed that social connection of work. So we did a number of things. The first was increased communication with key messages around what was happening, and just messaging that we as a leadership team were there to support them through this. and then having that more direct connect between the managers and the team member to check in to see that they were okay. Did they need more support in their office environment? How were they coping with the workload? And, really opening up your home is a very personal thing. So I think the point that Colin made is being respectful and allowing people to share in a way that they're comfortable with. The other thing that community connection definitely was more challenged. But we set up a collaboration working group across our team to ideate and bring to life ways in which we could connect, so that was representative of what the team may enjoy. And we did things like themed wine nights and trivia. And we continued to work more closely using technology. I do think that this is an opportunity for us to reimagine work moving forward.
Thank you. And Abby, is there anything you'd add to that? And we haven't talked so much about the wellbeing challenges of all of this. Is there anything you'd add on that front?
Yeah, look, just a couple of things that we've seen that we've been doing here that have worked well. I think, we already have a wellbeing program that's offered to all staff. So making sure everybody was reminded and knew there's free counselling sessions on there, completely independent of the organisation, completely confidential. So even if you're not okay and you don't want to talk about it at work, there is resources and things there. So actively encouraging and making sure that there's people there. I think reminding the organisation and leaders that there are many different types of individuals. They might be stuck at home on their own. That's a different complexity to someone who's stuck at home working with 2 kids in the house. And therefore people are going to respond differently. So try to find a number of solutions. There's been online yoga classes, online exercise classes, trivia nights, all the things that are, you opt in or opt out, and it doesn't matter whether you do or don't, but they're there and they're sort of solutions for you. We have mental first aiders. So individuals who are trained so that you can contact them anytime and have a conversation, and they're in your peer group, leveraging your ERG groups, and making sure that you keep with all the things that work. So it's challenging, but keep going, and trying to ensure that people have a boundary between work and non-work, especially when they're typically set up in their bedroom and they may stay there almost 24 hours a day now, is create boundaries and make sure that people are comfortable saying, no, it's time to go and live my life now, even if I'm not moving very far.
Yeah, thank you. And it feels like this period of time is going to continue with this remote working and that sharing of ideas around how we continue to do that well, and the onus on leaders to really drive that and continue to make more effort is going to continue to be very, very, very important. So we're coming up to the hour, so I'd love to thank you all for your contributions. I hope you in the audience have found it an interesting conversation as well. I think that the 2 takeaways that I've got, although there have been many, that coming together of hearts and minds is a key one for me, and also the moments of truth, which I think we can all ponder on and reflect on how that exhibits itself in our own working lives. Thank you to the audience as well for listening. Please do get in touch with any of us through the usual ways if you have any particular questions you'd like to follow up on. And thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.